Where do you think she is?
I don't know. I'm dying to know. And to tell you the truth, I think it would benefit you to get it off your... Because you're not a criminal.
No, you're not.
No. You gotta tell me. Beat me up.
I could give you a scenario.
Yes. Give me a scenario.
I ask a guy that picks up dumpsters behind, like Wendy's, Burger King.
Yeah.
I said, what do you do with that trash?
Yeah.
He said, take it to the dump.
Oh, you put her in the dumpster.
But I didn't kill her. Actually, I kind of did.
Yeah, kinda.
Kind of.
Yeah.
I kind of did.
Yeah.
I was at the station and I was doing some paperwork, and a gentleman walked in and he was requesting a supervisor. Brian Heisler said that his main concern was where his sister was.
Brian said a day or two earlier he'd gotten a phone call from Phil and said that Roberta had passed away in Memphis, Tennessee, about 750 miles from Hartville, Ohio.
Philip told him that Roberta had passed away in the vehicle, and two EMS personnel took her body and said that they were going to take her to the coroner's office. And then Philip left and came home without Roberta's body. So Brian was definitely very upset and just wondering what happened.
My brother-in-law's name is Phil Snyder.
And then her name was?
Roberta, she goes by Bobby. They've lived in Hartville their whole lives. So we call the other family members and everything. His story is, it's changed 3 times now. Originally, they were in a parking lot to go into the hotel, and she collapsed. At first, he says he called an ambulance. Well, now, just a few minutes ago, one of his sons called and said that he called the coroner's office in Memphis. They have no record of anything. So when we asked him again about it, now he said he didn't call an ambulance. There happened to be an ambulance in the parking lot.
Okay.
The other part of the story is supposedly he had her cremated and left the ashes down there and came home.
Okay. So where is he at now?
He's back home. He's back here. He won't tell us nothing. He won't tell. Who cremates a body the very next day and then leaves the ashes there and comes home?
I don't know. I mean, that doesn't make sense to me whatsoever.
Yesterday would have been her 70th birthday.
Okay. How old's he?
Phil would be about 72 or 73. They've been married for 53 years. I'm not angry. I don't know. I just want him...
You just want answers.
I don't want to accuse him, and I'm not. But he's got to tell us something.
Yeah, and I agree.
And the story's got to start to make sense at some point.
I ended up speaking with the chief because the situation just didn't make sense, and there was definitely more to the story.
If the story that Philip told was true, that she passed away of natural causes in Memphis, that would not be a crime. But not knowing where her body is, now it's a crime. Because you have to properly care for the corpse. Especially if you're out of state and you have a death like that, there would have to be an autopsy. The sergeant said, so what are we gonna do? And I said, we're gonna find her.
Roberta was friends with my grandmother. They lived in the same neighborhood. When I first met Roberta, she was shy and, reserved, kind of keeping herself. But when Phil wasn't around, she would open up. She was very uplifting and very kind. She was gentle, but she could put her foot in the ground if she really needed to. So she could stand her ground. I got to know her through playing cards. Euchre, Roberta really helped me understand the game. She may not have always shown it, but deep down she had a competitive edge. I feel like she would bring a smile to your face because she would remind me of, my grandma.
Our decision was to interview him at his home so he would feel more comfortable. My goal was to get him to open up and explain what happened to his wife, so I wanted to act like I didn't know that she was missing.
Are you Phil?
Yeah.
You mind if I step in for a second?
Sure, good morning.
How you doing?
Doing good?
Good. Hey, we had some calls from family members, and they just wanted us to come out and check and make sure you're okay on you and your wife. You guys okay?
I'm okay, yes.
Okay.
My wife passed away
Okay, when did that happen?
the 6th.
The 6th of
Yeah.
January?
Yeah. We went down to Memphis to see Elvis's down there, and she choked on her phlegm. She'd been choking for about a year.
Okay.
And she wanted to go down one more time before she died. I think she knew she was going to die.
Okay. So this happened down in Memphis then?
Yeah.
So she was choking on her phlegm and there was an ambulance or?
Well, these guys were there, and they was checking on someone, and they didn't need any help. And I said, "Can you help me? My wife is having a very bad problem." And they said, said she was gone.
Okay.
She had passed away.
Where'd they transport her to?
I'm not sure where.
During that interview, there was an uneasy feeling because I know if that was me, I would definitely not be home when my wife's body is somewhere else.
So where's your wife now? What happened to her?
They took her to a place where they cremate people.
Okay, and you don't know where that is either?
No. They said I didn't need to stay. If I wanted to, I could just go ahead and go home.
Even though I spoke with him, he still wasn't giving a lot of answers to help us find Roberta.
And in this day and age, you can't just drop a body off with some paramedics who are down in Memphis, Tennessee, and not know where they took her or what they did with her.
But I'm okay, as I can be. I'm glad you stopped, though.
Yeah, I'm sure it was a tragic.
It's a bitch. Life is a bitch.
Can be sometimes.
Yeah.
If you need anything, let us know, okay?
Thank you.
Absolutely.
I still felt that there was more to this story.
Me too.
And obviously we need to get to the bottom of it to figure out where she is so we can give the answers to the family. I contacted the coroner, contacted multiple EMS agencies, multiple hospitals in the general area, and there was nothing matching that name or description of Roberta. I thought the plot was thickening, and it was definitely getting weirder by the second. At this point, I believe there might be some foul play involved.
I realized that we needed to go in and search the house because she could be laying dead in there. She could be alive in there. We don't know anything other than what Phil said. And if I would have interviewed him at the station, I wouldn't have the ability to ask him to let me search the house so easily.
I went down. She wanted to go to...
This is Andy Boyce, by the way. He's one of our police. Nice to meet you, sir. How are you doing?
What do you do?
It's good.
Anyway, she wanted to go to Grace one time before she passed away. She wasn't feeling it.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you have any receipts from that hotel or anything to show?
Yes.
Okay.
Let me go get one.
Yeah, if you don't mind. Sir, can I ask a favor of you?
Yes.
We really have to cover all of our bases. So would it be okay while you get the receipt, if Officer Boyce would just go through your house just to make sure that your wife isn't here? He won't go through any drawers or anything. but just to look to make sure that she's not.
I think so.
We didn't know if she was dead or alive. The purpose was to make sure that she wasn't in there or there wasn't some blood-soaked area on the floor.
We've got so much stuff in the basement.
We walked all through his house.
I couldn't tell. I thought something was there. I thought there was something hidden. You can look with the flashlight, like down in that gap.
When you guys slept with her, did she have a good night's sleep? Was she up coughing all night?
No, she might not go to sleep till midnight.
Okay, and then she'd
But
sleep in?
I would give her pills.
Okay.
Then I got her going around 9:30, 10.
But you left Sparta, the Ramada in Sparta, Kentucky. And she was alive when you left Sparta.
Yes.
He lacked compassion. If my wife is missing, I have a little more concern about her whereabouts.
Sir, we go back upstairs?
Yes.
So my gut reaction to this whole thing is he killed her, and he's going to do everything in his power to not divulge that he killed her. I decided I was going to start pushing him a little bit.
Well, let's hold on a minute here. See, I've been a policeman for a long time. For many, many years. I was a CVSA examiner, which is kind of like a lie detector test. What I can tell you is that your story doesn't make a lot of sense, because a dead body is a very, very serious issue. So, sir, it's time for you to tell us what you haven't told us so far.
I've told you everything I can tell you.
I was testing him because I didn't know to what degree I could push him, and keeping him comfortable with me was very important.
We are really good at what we do, and if we spend hours collectively, lots of hours trying to figure this out, and we still don't know, then we're missing something.
If I can think of something, I will call you. If I can think of anything.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Later that day, I reached out to the hotel manager in Sparta, Kentucky. The room that Philip got that night was underneath the camera. And the desk where he checked in had a camera. And he said, "Chief, there was no couple. It was just him."
At this point, where is Roberta? The hotel was not that far out of the state of Ohio.
And that was the first real concrete evidence we had that she did not get to Memphis.
Sit down.
How you doing?
I'm doing as good as
You look tired, man.
as good as I can do, I guess. So I was laying down trying to take a nap.
My goal was to confront him because I wanted to see how he would react. Why didn't she go into the Ramada Inn?
Why didn't she go in?
Yeah.
She did.
Who checked in?
I did.
Where was she?
In the truck.
And then what happened there?
And then we went in and went into the room.
Okay. Well, Ramada Inn documents that you were the only person who checked in. And on all of their video footage, your wife is not seen.
But she was there.
I'm going to show you something here. That's you checking into the mine.
Yes.
Okay. That's you going into room 201.
Yes.
That's you as you're leaving room 201.
Okay.
There's no Roberta. That's a still picture taken from a video.
She was there.
But that's not what the video is. You can almost see it unfolding in front of you, how he dips into an emotional state. He's caught in our crossfires at this moment. I was concerned he could come out with a weapon of some sort. I was literally prepared to take out my firearm and shoot him. I didn't know if he would be a threat to himself or a threat to us. You can see my right hand was sitting on my sidearm, just in case he came around the corner with anything aggressive.
When he started to come out, yeah, we didn't know what he had or what he was doing, so we were ready for anything. But I believe he literally went to the bedroom just to collect his thoughts so he could come out and just give us another story.
Here's the situation, Phil. We fully believe that your wife had a significant medical condition. And we fully believe that she died. The rest of it we don't believe.
Okay.
First of all, you don't want your kids to think you did something
I
wrong.
didn't do anything. I didn't do anything.
Well, then where is she? And what you don't want to have happen.
But I've been married to her for 53 years, and I love her.
And here's the situation. The law says you're not allowed to lie to us and make us work real hard to prove that. It's a
You
crime.
gonna take me to jail?
Well, let me finish.
Are
Okay?
you gonna take me to jail?
I don't want to, no.
If I tell you that I put her in the Tennessee River, will you take me to jail?
Well, no, but we gotta go to the Tennessee River and look for her.
I didn't do nothing to her. It was on the way home. I put her in. I was just barely able to lift her up and throw her over the edge. And I put her in the river. And the current took her away.
So why did you throw her into the river?
I wanted her to be safe with nature. And I figured if she went downstream, no one would ever be able to find her. I can bring the map down.
We'll go with you. Let me ask you this. She died of natural causes. If you didn't do anything, why did you throw her in the river?
I don't know. I was in shock. I don't know. I don't remember.
We went down, we looked at maps with Phil. I definitely was mixed about it because he was a very, very good liar. I didn't think that she was in the river, but once he stuck to that story, we have to disprove it, or we have to prove it.
Take care.
He brought out a helicopter and boats and all trained vehicles to go along the shorelines, and he conducted a good search.
But we never found the body.
His spontaneous actions told me we're touching a nerve that's causing him to try to dig his way out of it. We decided we were going to come back the next day with a cadaver dog to go through the house.
Do you mind if I follow behind, or do you want? Okay.
As we entered the residence, you could tell the cadaver dog really wanted to go in a specific direction. We ended up going into the basement, and Canine Jet bolted directly for a red bin that was located under a table.
He is looking at a red bin.
All right, so we got this area here. It could be something. It could be this. It could be this. I mean,
This could have been in the truck when. Yeah.
Watch when I smell. You'll be able to smell it. I'm gonna leave like that.
Oh yeah, I can smell something.
Something's in there. Maybe real quick and see how if it's okay if you and I go through it, or he wants me to take it.
As soon as you opened the red bin, you could smell a very distinct odor.
There's no body here, but there's a very bad smell in this tote. It's got Christmas decorations in it.
There were what appeared to be stains of blood. And in the bottom of that tub was a white plastic bag. And inside that white plastic bag was the front of a sweatshirt that had been cut off that said Hartville, Ohio, USA.
I believe he definitely cut off for a reason, because that's going to indicate exactly where she was from.
I had a conversation with our coroner. Unfortunately, she said, look, if there was more blood, I might be able to say, yes, this is a homicide. But it was just little specks, little stains of blood here and there, and that was frustrating. We needed to find the body of Roberta Snyder. We found out he used Roberta's credit card on the way to and from Graceland.
And the first stop on this journey was in Worcester, Ohio,
which is an hour away from Hartville, Ohio, and he filled up with gas.
So I contacted the general manager of the store and asked her to review video from that date.
And that video shows Phil pulling in, but there's nobody in the passenger seat. It's just Phil, all by himself.
That obviously tells me that she was not in the vehicle 40 minutes from his residence.
I have never before interviewed a murder suspect in a psych ward in a hospital. But after getting some assurances from the staff there, we went ahead and did it. This really isn't any different than the conversations we've had in the past.
Okay.
Doesn't matter what you say without arresting him.
Okay.
You know, you're going to stay here in their care,
Okay.
no matter where this conversation goes.
Okay.
Okay? So she was alive when you left your home.
Yes.
Okay. So why do we have video of you pulling into the Bell store in Worcester on January the 4th, and you're the only person in your truck?
I don't know. I don't know.
Well, no, you have to know, because you were the only person in your truck. Here's your truck. I don't have the video, but I got pictures. There's your truck in Worcester, Ohio, about noon on January 4th, and there's nobody in your truck with you. So
I don't know. She didn't die. She didn't die at home. She died en route.
Well, you know how far from your home Worcester is?
No.
Not very. So you're telling me that she got into the truck in the garage, and somewhere between your home and Worcester, she died and you threw her in the back of the truck?
No. I'm not telling you that at all.
Okay. Well, explain this to me. When you threw her in the river, what was she wearing?
She had blue sweats and blue shirt. And I didn't throw her. I laid her.
Phil, why did you cut up her shirt?
I didn't. Where was this at?
Phil, why'd you cut up her shirt?
I didn't. Where's that at?
In your basement.
No, that's something that she's done.
No.
I didn't do that.
It was in that red bin under that table, Phil. I believe you cut it off because it said Hartville, Ohio, and if anybody found her, that's that missing lady from Hartville, Ohio. That's why you cut the front of the shirt off of her.
I don't remember cutting any shirt off of anybody.
Okay, my plan is pretty simple. I'm going to go to the grand jury, and I'm going to explain to them that your wife is dead. We found her decomposing tissue in your basement.
I didn't cut the shirt. I didn't cut any shirt off.
Well, the science says that's not true.
I didn't harm my wife.
Okay. Well, then, if that's the truth, why aren't we talking about what really happened? Listen,
I don't want to continue this.
So, is this where you want to leave it? That you're just not going to say anything more? That we're not going to find Roberta?
They'll find her in the Tennessee River. They'll find her.
Well, we've been looking. We've been looking since the 11th, and we haven't found her yet. Which, given your history of being deceptive, not being truthful with us, is a strong indication that she really didn't go in the Tennessee River.
I don't know what to say.
He knew we were getting very close to being able to prove what he did, and he didn't want to play ball anymore. But he never said, I want a lawyer. He never said anything that would prohibit us from further investigating. I was interviewing a couple people for positions in my police department, and Joan Bauer is a rock star police officer, and we hired her.
I talked to the chief about this case because it was all over the news. I asked him, hey, can I take a crack at this? You know, undercover, that is my background. The chief was like, yeah, let's give it a crack. They showed me a picture of him, but I did not read any police reports, so I could develop the undercover person that I needed to be without being biased. I started doing surveillance, and he made it pretty easy for me to get a pattern very quickly. At lunchtime, I observed his truck at a local fast food restaurant, and I went in. There was a lady sitting at a booth next to me, so I positioned myself so that I could put the camera on him, and I began to talk rather loudly to the lady. I gave my story that I was in town taking care of my sick mother.
Oh, that's the thing. I'm really sort of bored.
Oh, it's really neat. You should just go out there just to experience it because it's a really, really
I will
place.
definitely do that.
Right after I had pretty much laid out why I'm in this small town, he meets with a friend and he moves his seat closer to where I'm sitting. Yeah, I'm staying with her.
Help her out.
Yeah, but I can't stand the lady who helps her during the day. So I always say, I got stuff to do, so I'm just like doing nothing.
So when you going back to Cincinnati?
I don't know. Hopefully, I mean, she's pretty sick. It sounds horrible, but not till she goes. You can see that he looks away and he lost interest during that. So in the beginning, I'm deciding how I'm going to mold the character to befriend him. Hi, how are you?
You see the girl over there at Wendy's?
Yeah, last week. Yeah.
Where you get her?
Huh?
Different restaurant.
Different restaurant. Yeah, I can't go to the same one every day. Just trying to get out, but it's so beautiful. Somebody said that there's a park around too. All right. What's your name?
Phil.
I'm Missy.
Nancy?
Yeah. Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Again. I know. Well, it's nice to have somebody to talk to around here, let me tell you. He did appear to be somewhat lonely. So I created the person who just needs to hang out and talk during the day. So I'm going to take a drive by and check that out. Thanks.
Where's the property?
On Waterloo Road?
Are you gonna go to the Y right now?
Yeah. I got the
Artificial room?
She does, but she doesn't use it. He believed I was just liking him for who he was, and then it started with his wanting to help me take care of my mother. He told me how I should kill her, and then if I did, to call him, and he would come help me. And from there, I started to change the script and ask him more about himself. He said, my wife died not too long ago, and I pretty much acted like I was surprised. It seemed like I was getting closer to the truth and what he did to Roberta. He called me and asked if I would meet him 10 miles from Hartville, and he explained he wanted to tell me more about Roberta. He did not want people to hear.
Where do you think she is?
I don't know. I'm dying to know. And to tell you the truth, I think it would benefit you to get it off because you're not a criminal.
No, you're not.
No.
I had to be really careful because this was a form of interrogation that had to be done gently.
You gotta tell me. Beat me up.
I could give you a scenario.
Yes. Give me a scenario.
I ask a guy that picks up dumpsters behind, like Wendy's, Burger King.
Yeah.
I said, what do you do with that trash?
Yeah.
He said, take it to the dump.
I'm not real smart. So, you put her in the dumpster. Oh, and she's buried 10 feet deep in garbage now. They won't find her. There's no way.
Just a scenario.
I know. So just a scenario. How long does it take for a body to decompose?
A year. But she might not be in garbage. She might be in the Tennessee.
What is it in hospital or something? Yeah.
No, come on. Okay. You love to tease with me, don't you?
I don't know. Why do we trust each other so much?
I don't know. I think because we're a lot alike, probably. You think?
I don't know. It's like I've known you
I know.
30 years.
I know. Today's date is April 20th, year 2018.
I did have a feeling that we were right on the cusp. He felt like no one trusted him.
Well, morning.
And I created just a person that wouldn't judge him. I went into the restaurant.
How are you?
I'm good.
Did you bring your cards?
I did.
He was a lot more relaxed than he had ever been. It was like we were long lost friends, and right away I could tell that he was going to tell me the truth.
I want to know what drove you. I want to know what drives Phil.
I had had enough. I had enough.
Were you fighting, or it was just like...
It was a pretty good argument the night before,
Yeah.
but I didn't kill her. Actually, I kind of did.
Yeah, kinda. Yeah.
I kind of did.
Yeah.
The video recorder died like right at that time, but I did have the backup audio device going. It was very eerie, and you could almost like see it peel off of him. The stress of just carrying it all this time.
Say I get ill,
Yes.
or they take me to jail.
They're not taking you to jail.
Say they do.
Okay.
I want you to get your attorney
Mm-hmm.
to come and marry us.
Okay.
Okay?
Yes. Oh. So you could tell me anything, and then they can't make a spouse testify against a spouse.
Duh. Would be a marriage of convenience.
I have a good attorney down in Cincinnati. That's all I can do. However, you have to tell me how she fell out.
That was a shock. And I had to roll with it. I knew that from then I had to get the confession that day. And so I was able to push him with, if I agree to do something like that, you have to trust me enough to tell me, everything.
Can you imagine a hammer this big and this big around?
Did you bonk her in the head?
Maybe. Scenario-wise, maybe.
So, was she sleeping when you hit her in the head, or were you fighting?
She was asleep.
Yeah,
Just a scenario.
right. On the couch?
Just a scenario.
Or were you worried about the couch having blood on it?
I didn't care.
Right.
It was a love scene.
Okay. Front of the head? Side of the head? No.
Just a scenario.
Oh, yes.
Right there.
Right.
Oh,
But was there, like, I can imagine it going,
no.
no?
Just a scenario.
Yeah.
You can buy these. It's like a cloth. It's like a wash rag, but I gently laid one of those on the side of her head
Before.
before.
So it just took one hit? And that was it?
And that was it.
It was a full confession. He used his hands as visuals for how he killed her and just laid it out there for me to pretty much accept it.
Does it feel good to tell someone?
It feels real good.
Yeah.
I needed that.
I knew then that I had him. However, I did not know whether I had it on the audio or the video. So I left it with him that we would meet later that day.
We agreed to meet down at the FBI office so that we could all hear it and decide whether or not this was indeed a confession.
But I didn't kill her. Actually, I kind of did.
Yeah, kinda. Yeah.
I kind of did.
Yeah.
When I heard Phil Snyder, I'm thinking that we got you, Phil. We finally got you. And I told the chief it's time, go arrest him.
I got my camera.
Step up. You're kidding. Step up.
We entered the restaurant and he was in disbelief that we had a warrant for him.
Right up until he got his handcuffs put on, he thought for sure he had fooled us.
There you go.
He took him to Bullitt, Kentucky, and showed him a dumpster that he claimed to have put Roberta's body in.
We tracked down where the landfill was. And we went out there and we watched the 200,000-pound bulldozer leveling everything. It compresses everything. So she's somewhere in that 500 by 500 foot grid out there, anywhere up to 25 feet below the surface. But we just didn't have $15 million that would allow us to bring her back for proper burial.
We thought we could come up with more for the family, but that was the end of the line. That was very sad.
We said a prayer for her, and we left. It's not a happy ending for anybody, but there's bad people in the world, and we need intuitive cops to conduct these interviews and to be flexible with how they deal with people to bring justice to a case, justice to a family.
I thought we lost somebody that you could look to and could learn a lot from. I would love to tell her thank you, because she was always kind and treated me with respect, and it will always stick with me. I'm glad I got to meet her, and I'm glad that she was part of my life.
"55 years after the horrific murders, the killer of 2 teenagers was finally identified, the murders of Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky. Part 1. On a quiet spring morning in 1956, a discovery in a remote area of Montana would begin one of the longest and most haunting criminal investigations in the state's history. It was the kind of case that seemed impossible to solve. A young couple, full of dreams and plans for the future, had vanished into the darkness of a single night. When investigators finally found them, the evidence left behind created more questions than answers. For decades, the names Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky remained connected to one of Montana's most painful cold cases. Their deaths became a mystery passed from one generation of investigators to another. The case survived through changing technology, new detectives, and countless hours of searching for answers that always seemed just out of reach. For more than half a century, one question remained unanswered. Who killed Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky? The answer would not come from a confession. It would not come from a forgotten witness suddenly stepping forward. It would come decades later from a scientific breakthrough that transformed criminal investigations around the world, forensic genetic genealogy. But before the breakthrough, before the name of the suspect was finally revealed, there was only a crime scene, a devastated community, and 2 young lives that ended far too soon. In 1956, Montana was a very different place. Many communities were small, close-knit, and built around familiar faces. People knew their neighbors. Families often lived in the same areas for generations. The idea that a violent crime could happen among them was difficult to comprehend. Lloyd Dwayne Bogle was 18 years old. He was young, energetic, and remembered by those who knew him as a typical teenager beginning to experience adulthood. Like many young people of his age, he had hopes, relationships, and plans for the future. Patricia Kalitsky was also 18. She was described by people close to her as a kind young woman with a promising life ahead. The 2 teenagers were believed to have been romantically involved, and on the night of June 3, 1956, they were together. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening. But somewhere during that night, something went terribly wrong. The exact moments leading up to the murders have remained one of the most tragic mysteries surrounding the case. What is known is that Lloyd and Patricia were found dead near Great Falls, Montana. Their bodies were discovered the following day, and the scene immediately suggested investigators were dealing with a deliberate act of violence. Lloyd Bogle had been shot. Patricia Kalitsky had also been killed. The discovery shocked the local community and immediately launched a major investigation. At the time, police faced enormous challenges. The tools available to investigators in 1956 were limited compared with modern forensic methods. There was no digital evidence, no cell phone records, no surveillance footage, no advanced DNA testing. Investigators had to rely on traditional police work. They searched for witnesses. They examined physical evidence. They questioned people who may have seen something unusual. They tried to reconstruct the final hours of two teenagers whose lives had ended in tragedy. But the investigation quickly encountered a major obstacle. There appeared to be no clear suspect. The crime had happened in an era when evidence could easily disappear. Memories faded. Witnesses moved away. Records were incomplete. Years passed, and the case slowly became colder. Yet investigators never completely abandoned it. Over the decades, different officers examined the evidence again. New generations of law enforcement officials revisited old files, hoping that advances in technology could reveal what earlier investigators could not. The case contained one crucial element that would eventually become the key to solving the mystery: biological evidence left behind at the crime scene. At the time of the murders, investigators could not use that evidence in the way modern detectives can today. DNA profiling did not exist. The science that would later revolutionize criminal investigations was still decades away. The evidence remained silent. For years, it sat in police files, waiting for technology to catch up. Meanwhile, the families of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky lived with unanswered questions. A murder investigation does not end when the headlines disappear. For loved ones, the absence of justice becomes a permanent wound. Every anniversary brought back memories of what had been lost. Two teenagers had been taken away. Two families had been forced to live without knowing who was responsible. And an entire community carried the weight of an unsolved crime. The passage of time made the case even more difficult. The 1950s became the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s. A new century arrived. The world changed dramatically. Technology advanced. But the mystery remained. Many cold cases eventually disappear into history. Some become forgotten stories buried in old newspaper archives. But the murders of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky remain different because investigators believe the truth was still hidden somewhere within the evidence. The question was never whether the crime happened. The question was whether the person responsible could ever be identified. For more than 5 decades, the answer appeared to be no. Then, in the 21st century, a new era of criminal investigation began. DNA technology had transformed from a scientific experiment into one of the most powerful tools available to law enforcement. Investigators could now examine genetic material in ways that would have been unimaginable in 1956. But even DNA alone was not always enough. A sample could exist. A profile could be created. Yet if that profile did not match anyone in law enforcement databases, the trail could still end. That was the challenge facing investigators in the Bogle and Kalitsky case. They had evidence. They had a mystery. But they still needed a name. The breakthrough came through a method that was changing how detectives approached decades-old crimes. Instead of searching only traditional criminal databases, investigators began using genetic genealogy, comparing DNA evidence with publicly available genetic information from relatives to build family connections. It was a new approach, a method that had already helped solve other cold cases. And now, decades after 2 teenagers were murdered on a quiet Montana night, investigators wondered if it could finally reveal the identity of the person who had escaped justice for 55 years. The evidence that had remained silent for generations was about to speak. And when it did, it would bring the case back into the national spotlight. Because after more than half a century of uncertainty, the mystery surrounding Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky was finally approaching the moment everyone had been waiting for. The search for the truth was entering its final chapter. But first, investigators had to uncover the hidden connections buried within the DNA and follow a trail that had remained invisible since 1956. For more than 5 decades, the murder scene involving Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky remained frozen in time. The evidence had survived. The questions had survived. But the person responsible had disappeared into the shadows of history. The passage of years created a painful reality for investigators. A crime that once dominated headlines had become a cold case. A file filled with unanswered questions. A tragedy remembered mostly by the families who continued to carry the loss. But behind the scenes, the investigation never completely stopped. The case of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky remained open, waiting for the possibility that a future discovery could finally break the silence. The original investigation in 1956 began under very different circumstances from modern criminal investigations. Detectives worked with the tools available at the time. They relied heavily on interviews, physical evidence, and careful observation. Every detail mattered because there were no advanced databases, no automated searches, and no technology capable of analyzing tiny traces left behind at a crime scene. Investigators knew they were dealing with a brutal double homicide. They knew 2 teenagers had been killed. They knew the crime scene contained evidence that suggested the attacker had been close to the victims. But knowing what happened and proving who was responsible were 2 completely different challenges. The first days after the discovery were filled with urgency. Authorities searched for anyone who might have seen Lloyd and Patricia before their deaths. They examined their movements, their relationships, and the people connected to their lives. Like many investigations, detectives followed numerous possibilities. They looked at personal connections. They considered whether someone close to the victims could have had a motive. They explored whether the crime could have involved a stranger. Every possibility had to be examined. Every lead had to be followed. But one by one, those paths failed to provide the answer investigators needed. The case slowly became more difficult with each passing year. People who may have remembered important details grew older. Some moved away. Some passed away. Memories that could have helped investigators reconstruct the night of the murders became harder to verify. Time became the greatest enemy. For the families of Lloyd and Patricia, the lack of an arrest created a different kind of suffering. There was no courtroom, no explanation, no opportunity to hear the truth from the person responsible. Instead, they were left with uncertainty. The victims became names connected to a mystery. But to their loved ones, they were not just names in a case file. They were children. They were friends. They were young people whose futures were stolen. For decades, investigators preserved the evidence connected to the crime. This decision would later become critical. Because while the case remained unsolved, science continued to advance. In the decades following the murders, forensic science experienced a transformation. Fingerprint analysis became more sophisticated. Digital records changed police investigations. And perhaps the greatest revolution came from the ability to analyze human DNA. When DNA profiling became widely used in criminal investigations, it changed the way detectives viewed old cases. Evidence once considered impossible to use could suddenly become valuable. A small biological sample could contain information that connected a suspect to a crime scene. For many cold cases, DNA became the final remaining hope. But there was still a problem. Even when investigators developed a DNA profile, they needed something to compare it against. If the suspect was not already in a law enforcement database, the evidence could lead nowhere. This was the situation facing the investigators who revisited the Bogle and Kalitsky case decades later. They had preserved evidence. They had a DNA profile. But they did not have a name. The breakthrough would come from a new investigative approach that had begun changing the world of criminal justice. Forensic genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional DNA searches, which attempt to match a suspect directly through criminal databases, genetic genealogy works by identifying relatives connected through shared DNA. Investigators can examine genetic relationships and build family trees, sometimes reaching a person who was never previously considered a suspect. This method opened new possibilities for cases that had remained unsolved for generations. And for the first time, the 1956 murders in Montana had a realistic chance of being solved. Investigators began carefully analyzing the available genetic evidence. The goal was not simply to find a direct match. The goal was to find a connection, a distant relative, a family line, a hidden path leading back through decades. Every genetic connection became a potential clue. Every surname became a possibility. Every branch of a family tree could contain the answer. The process was complex and required patience. Investigators had to separate unrelated genetic matches from meaningful ones. They had to study family histories, records, and relationships stretching across generations. It was detective work combined with science, a search through both the past and the present. Slowly, the invisible trail began to take shape. The investigation moved from the crime scene of 1956 into the digital age. The world around the case had changed. The original detectives who first searched for answers were long gone. The teenagers who had lost their lives were remembered by fewer people each year. But the evidence remained. And now, after 55 years, investigators were closer than ever before. The question that had haunted the case for generations was beginning to receive an answer. Who was the person connected to the DNA? Who was the individual whose actions had left two families waiting for justice? The genetic genealogy investigation would eventually point authorities toward a name that had never been publicly associated with the murders before. A man whose connection to the crime had remained hidden for decades. But identifying a person was only the beginning. Investigators still had to confirm the evidence. They had to establish the connection between the genetic trail and the original crime. They had to make sure that after 55 years, justice was not only possible, but supported by facts. Because in a case this old, every detail mattered. A mistake could reopen old wounds. A false accusation could destroy another life. The investigators knew they were dealing with more than a cold case. They were dealing with the memory of two teenagers whose lives ended violently on a night that should have been ordinary. The families of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky had waited decades for this moment. And now, after generations of uncertainty, the silence surrounding their deaths was finally beginning to break. The evidence that had waited patiently for more than half a century was finally leading investigators toward the truth. But before the final answer could be revealed, detectives had to follow the trail all the way back, through forgotten records, distant relatives, and a connection that had remained hidden since the summer of 1956. For 55 years, the murders of Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky remained one of Montana's most painful mysteries. The case had outlived generations of investigators. It had survived changing technology, changing police methods, and decades of unanswered questions. But the evidence had never truly disappeared. Deep inside the records of the investigation was a silent witness that had been waiting for the right moment. DNA. A piece of the puzzle left behind in 1956. At the time of the murders, nobody could have imagined how important that evidence would become. In the 1950s, forensic science was limited compared with today. Investigators could collect physical evidence, but the ability to identify a person through genetic material was still decades away. The crime scene could tell investigators what happened, but it could not tell them who did it. For years, the killer remained a shadow, a person who had walked away from one of Montana's most shocking crimes, a person who had lived an entire lifetime while the victims' families continued searching for answers. Then, more than half a century later, the investigation entered a completely different era. The old evidence was examined again through the lens of modern science. The process began with a question that had challenged detectives for decades. Could the evidence from 1956 finally reveal the identity of the person responsible? The answer would come through a combination of traditional detective work and one of the most powerful developments in modern criminal investigations: forensic genetic genealogy. The method had changed the way authorities approached cold cases. Instead of waiting for a direct match inside criminal databases, investigators could search for distant biological connections and build a family tree backward through generations. It was a complicated process. A genetic match did not immediately reveal a suspect. It did not provide a name. Instead, it created a map. Investigators studied relatives connected through shared DNA. They examined family histories. They traced relationships between people who may have had no idea they were connected to a decades-old murder investigation. Every connection created another question. Every branch of the family tree offered another possibility. The investigation became a journey through time, a search that moved beyond the original crime scene and into the hidden history of families. The detectives were no longer only looking at what happened in 1956. They were looking at generations of information that had developed long after the crime. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The genetic evidence pointed investigators toward a specific family line, a path that eventually led them closer to the person they believed was responsible for the murders of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky. The name that emerged was not one that had dominated the headlines in 1956. It was not a person who had been publicly suspected for decades. The investigation had reached someone who had remained outside the spotlight for more than half a century. That person was identified as Kenneth Gould. For investigators, the discovery represented a historic moment. A case that had remained unsolved since the Eisenhower era was finally moving toward resolution. But identifying a potential suspect was only one step. Cold cases require more than a theory. They require evidence. They require confirmation. They require investigators to carefully connect the past with the present. Authorities began examining Gould's background and looking for additional evidence that could link him to the murders. The challenge was enormous. More than 55 years had passed. Many people connected to the original investigation were no longer alive. Physical evidence had aged. Memories had faded. But the science had provided investigators with something they had never had before: a direction, a person to investigate, a possible answer to a mystery that had haunted Montana for decades. The investigation eventually moved toward a dramatic conclusion. In 2011, authorities confirmed that Kenneth Gould had been identified as the person responsible for the murders of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky. But by that time, Gould was no longer alive. He had died in 2007. The man believed to have committed one of Montana's most infamous crimes had never faced a courtroom. He never stood before a judge. He never answered questions from the victims' families. He never explained what happened on that night in 1956. For many people connected to the case, this created a complicated sense of justice. The truth had finally emerged. The mystery had finally been solved. But the person responsible could never be held accountable in court. There would be no trial, no conviction, no sentence. Only the knowledge that after decades of uncertainty, investigators had finally uncovered the identity of the killer. For the families of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky, the announcement brought both relief and pain. After years of wondering whether the truth would ever be known, they finally had an answer. But answers do not erase loss. They do not bring back two young people whose lives ended before they had the chance to experience the future they deserved. Lloyd was only 18. Patricia was only 18. They were teenagers whose story became defined not by the lives they lived, but by the tragedy that ended them. The discovery of Gould's identity also demonstrated the extraordinary power of modern forensic science. A crime that seemed impossible to solve had been cracked by evidence collected generations earlier. The past had finally caught up with the present. But the case still contained mysteries. Even after the identification of Kenneth Gould, many questions about the events of that night remained unanswered. What exactly happened in the final moments before Lloyd and Patricia were killed? Why did the attack occur? What led Gould to the location where the teenagers were found? Those questions would likely never receive complete answers. The person who knew the truth was gone, and with him disappeared the possibility of a full confession. That reality remains one of the most haunting aspects of the case. A name was discovered. A suspect was identified. But the complete story of that night in 1956 remains partly locked in the past. The murders of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky became a powerful reminder that some cases are never truly forgotten. They may disappear from the front pages. They may sit quietly in old files. But for families searching for justice, time does not erase the need for answers. For more than half a century, the case waited. It waited for technology. It waited for science. It waited for someone to look at old evidence in a new way. And when that moment finally came, the silence surrounding one of Montana's most haunting crimes began to break. The mystery was no longer a question without an answer. But the story of Lloyd and Patricia and the long road toward justice revealed something deeper. Some victims are remembered not because their cases are solved quickly. They are remembered because even after decades pass, the search for truth continues. For more than half a century, the murders of Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky represented everything that defines a true cold case. A crime frozen in time. A mystery buried beneath decades of unanswered questions. A file that remained open while the world around it changed. In 1956, investigators had walked through the evidence with limited tools and almost impossible challenges. They had searched for witnesses, followed leads, and examined every detail they could find. But the technology needed to uncover the truth did not exist yet. The killer had left behind traces, but those traces remained silent until science caught up. The identification of Kenneth Gould through forensic genetic genealogy marked the end of one chapter of the investigation. But for many people connected to the case, it also opened a new and painful chapter. Because solving a cold case is not always the same as finding complete closure. A name had finally been attached to the crime. But the story of what happened on that night in 1956 remained incomplete. The investigators had answered the question of who was responsible. But many questions about why and how remained locked away forever. The tragedy began with two teenagers who had their entire futures ahead of them. Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky were not simply victims in a historical investigation. They were young people with families, friends, and dreams that ended suddenly. Their names became permanently connected to a crime that shocked Montana. But behind the headlines was a deeper human tragedy. Two families forced to live with uncertainty. A community forced to remember a violent act that seemed impossible to explain. And investigators who carried the weight of an unsolved case for decades. The eventual breakthrough demonstrated how dramatically criminal investigations had changed. In 1956, detectives depended on interviews, physical observations, and traditional evidence collection. By the 21st century, investigators had access to tools that previous generations could never have imagined. DNA analysis had transformed crime solving. Genetic genealogy had created new possibilities for cases that had reached dead ends. Old evidence was no longer simply evidence from the past. It had become a message waiting to be interpreted. The case of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky became one of the examples showing how technology could give forgotten investigations a second life. A crime that had appeared permanently unsolvable suddenly became a case that could move forward. But the road to identifying Gould was not simple. Investigators had to be patient and precise. Genetic genealogy is not like a fingerprint search where a single match instantly identifies a person. Instead, it requires building connections through shared DNA. The process involves examining relationships between individuals, studying family histories, and following patterns that can stretch across generations. Investigators must eliminate possibilities. They must verify information. They must ensure that the person identified through genetic connections is truly connected to the original crime. In a case as old as this one, accuracy was essential. A mistake would not only affect the investigation, it would affect the memory of the victims and the families who had waited decades for justice. The investigators followed the genetic trail carefully until it led them to Kenneth Gould. The discovery was significant because Gould had never been publicly identified as a suspect during the original investigation. For 55 years, the case had existed without a confirmed answer. Then, suddenly, the mystery had a name. But another reality remained. Kenneth Gould was already dead. He died before investigators publicly connected him to the murders. That meant the justice process looked very different from what many people expected. There would be no dramatic courtroom moment, no testimony, no cross-examination, no opportunity for families to hear an explanation directly from the person accused. The case was solved through evidence, not through a confession. And that created a unique emotional outcome. For investigators, it was a victory. For families, it was an answer they had waited decades to receive. But for many, it also carried a sense of unfinished business. Because a trial does more than determine guilt. It allows victims' families to speak. It allows communities to hear the full story. It allows a final public reckoning. In this case, that moment never came. The person identified as responsible could not be questioned about the crime. He could not explain what happened. He could not reveal what investigators had spent decades trying to understand. The final pieces of the story remained missing. And that absence became one of the most haunting elements of the case. Even after the breakthrough, investigators and historians continued examining what could be learned from the evidence. The case became a reminder that some mysteries survive not because there is no evidence, but because the evidence must wait for the right technology. For decades, the answer was hidden in something invisible. Something too small to be seen. Something that could not speak until science gave it a voice. The DNA evidence collected from a crime scene in the 1950s eventually became the bridge between past and present. It connected investigators from different generations. It connected a forgotten crime scene with a modern laboratory. It connected two teenagers who died in 1956 with the truth discovered in 2011. The story of Lloyd and Patricia also became part of a larger movement in law enforcement. Across the United States, investigators began revisiting old cases using new genetic methods. Murders that had remained unsolved for decades were reopened. Evidence, once considered useless, became valuable again. Families who had stopped expecting answers began receiving phone calls they never thought would come. The message was always the same. A case that seemed forgotten was not forgotten. The search had continued. The evidence had survived. The truth was still there. For the families of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky, that truth arrived after more than half a century. The world had changed completely since the night they were killed. Cars had changed. Technology had changed. The way police investigated crimes had changed. But the need for justice had remained exactly the same. The victims were still remembered. Their lives still mattered. And their story proved that time does not always erase the possibility of justice. Sometimes, the smallest piece of evidence can survive longer than anyone expects. Sometimes, a mystery can remain hidden for generations before the right moment arrives. And sometimes, after decades of silence, the past finally speaks. The murders of Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky are no longer an unsolved mystery. But they remain a haunting reminder of what was lost. Two teenagers. Two families. One devastating night. And a question that remained unanswered for 55 years. Until science finally uncovered the truth. The story of Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky is not only a story about a crime. It is a story about time itself. A story about how a single night in 1956 could continue affecting lives for generations. A story about how a question left unanswered for decades could remain alive in the minds of investigators, families, and an entire community. And most importantly, it is a story about how the smallest pieces of evidence can survive long after memories begin to fade. When the murders first occurred, nobody could have predicted that the investigation would continue for more than half a century. Nobody could have imagined that detectives in the future would reopen the same case using technology that did not exist at the time of the crime. In 1956, the investigation depended on human observation. Detectives walked the scene. They collected physical evidence. They interviewed people who might have seen something. They tried to reconstruct the final moments of two teenagers whose lives ended in violence. But every investigation has limits. Every detective works within the tools available at the time. And in 1956, the science that would eventually identify the killer was still far beyond the imagination of most investigators. The evidence was there. The answer was there. But the connection between the two was missing. For decades, that gap remained. The murders of Lloyd and Patricia became one of those cases that haunted law enforcement because it represented a painful reality. Sometimes, investigators know a crime happened. Sometimes, they know evidence exists. But sometimes, the person responsible remains just beyond reach. The years after the murders brought changes not only to technology but also to society. The small communities of Montana changed. People who remembered the original investigation grew older. A new generation grew up knowing the case only as a tragic story from the past. But for the families of the victims, the passing of time did not make the loss smaller. The unanswered questions remained. Why did this happen? Who was responsible? Would the truth ever come? Those questions follow them through decades of anniversaries and memories. The pain of losing someone suddenly is difficult enough. But losing someone to violence without knowing who caused that loss creates another layer of suffering. There is no explanation, no accountability, no final moment where the family can look at the person responsible and hear the truth. Instead, there is only silence. And for many years, that silence surrounded the deaths of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky. But the silence was slowly beginning to break. The transformation began with advances in forensic science. DNA analysis changed criminal investigations forever. Before DNA technology, investigators often depended on physical descriptions, fingerprints, eyewitness accounts, and confessions. But DNA introduced something entirely different. A biological connection, a scientific signature, a way to compare evidence from a crime scene with a specific individual. The development of DNA testing gave hope to thousands of cold cases across the country. Cases that had been considered impossible to solve were reopened. Evidence that had been stored away for years was examined again. And in many cases, the past began revealing secrets that had remained hidden. The Bogle and Kalitsky investigation entered this new era. The evidence collected decades earlier was no longer simply an old piece of a forgotten case. It became a potential pathway to the truth. But even modern DNA testing had limitations. A DNA profile alone could not automatically reveal the identity of a person if that individual was not already included in available databases. Investigators still needed a way forward. That way forward came through forensic genetic genealogy. This method changed the direction of the investigation. Instead of searching only for a direct suspect match, investigators looked for genetic relatives. The idea was simple but powerful. A person's DNA carries information about their family connections. Even if the individual responsible for a crime was not listed in a database, relatives could provide clues, leading investigators toward the correct family line. The process required patience. It required detailed research. It required following connections that could stretch across generations. Investigators were essentially creating a family map from genetic information. Each connection narrowed the possibilities. Each discovery brought them closer. The investigation moved away from the original crime scene and into a much larger world of genealogy. Birth records, family relationships, historical documents, genetic similarities. A case that began on a lonely Montana road was now being investigated through information gathered from countless lives connected across decades. The detectives were searching through history itself. And eventually, the trail began pointing toward Kenneth Gould. The identification of Gould represented a major breakthrough. For 55 years, the case had existed without a confirmed answer. Now investigators had a person connected to the evidence. The mystery that had remained unsolved since 1956 was finally approaching resolution. But the discovery also raised difficult questions. Because solving a cold case is not always the same as providing every answer. A suspect can be identified. Evidence can establish responsibility. But the emotional questions often remain. Why did the victims become targets? What happened during the final moments of their lives? What thoughts went through the mind of the person responsible? Those answers disappeared with time. And because Gould was no longer alive when investigators identified him, the opportunity for a courtroom examination was gone. There would be no trial where every detail could be publicly explored. No testimony revealing what happened. No confession explaining the events of that night. The investigation had reached the truth, but not every mystery had been solved. This is one of the most difficult realities of many cold cases. Justice can arrive in different forms. Sometimes it comes through a conviction. Sometimes it comes through an official identification. Sometimes it comes through finally giving a family an answer after decades of uncertainty. For the families of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky, the identification of Gould meant they no longer had to wonder whether the case would ever be solved. The question that had followed them for more than half a century finally had an answer. The names of Lloyd and Patricia were no longer attached only to an unsolved crime. They became part of a story showing how persistence, science, and determination could overcome decades of silence. Their case demonstrated something powerful. A crime may grow cold, but evidence does not always disappear. A mystery may become forgotten by the public, but investigators and families may continue searching. And sometimes, after many years have passed, the truth can still be found. The murders of Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky began as a shocking tragedy in 1956. They became a decades-long investigation. They became a symbol of unanswered questions. And eventually, they became an example of how modern science could bring answers to a case that once seemed impossible to solve. But even with the identity of the killer revealed, the story of that night remains filled with tragedy. Because behind every investigation is not just evidence, not just dates, not just headlines. There are people. There are lives interrupted. There are families who waited. And there are memories that continue long after the investigation ends. For decades, the murders of Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky existed as a painful reminder of the limits of justice. The case had everything that defines a haunting cold case. 2 young victims. A shocking crime. A community searching for answers. And a person responsible who remained unknown for more than half a century. But beneath the unanswered questions was another reality. The investigation never truly ended. Even when the headlines disappeared, even when years passed without an arrest, the case remained alive in the records of law enforcement and in the memories of those who refused to forget. The discovery of Kenneth Gould as the person responsible was not the result of a single moment. It was the result of decades of persistence. It was the result of evidence being preserved. It was the result of investigators returning to a case that many people believed would never be solved. And it was the result of a new scientific approach that transformed how detectives looked at the past. For investigators working cold cases, time is both an enemy and an ally. Time can destroy evidence. Time can separate witnesses from the events they remember. Time can make a crime seem impossible to solve. But time can also bring new technology. It can create new opportunities. It can allow old evidence to reveal information that nobody could see before. The case of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky became a powerful example of this reality. The crime occurred during an era when forensic science was still developing. The methods that are considered standard today were unknown or unavailable. There were no national DNA databases. There were no advanced genetic searches. There were no digital records tracking movements and communications. Investigators had to rely on traditional methods. They had to build a case through observation, interviews, and physical evidence. And while those methods were valuable, they had limitations. A witness might remember something incorrectly. A clue might not be recognized as important. Evidence might exist without the technology needed to understand it. That was the challenge investigators faced for many years. The case contained information, but it was information waiting for the future. When forensic genetic genealogy emerged as a powerful investigative tool, it changed the possibilities for cases like this one. The method represented a major shift in criminal investigations. Instead of asking only who is already in the database, investigators could now ask a different question. Who is connected to this DNA through family? That change opened doors that had remained closed for decades. In the Bogle and Kalitsky investigation, the genetic evidence became the foundation for a new search. Investigators began following connections through family relationships. They looked at distant relatives. They studied genetic links. They worked backward through generations. The process was not quick. It required careful analysis. Every possible connection had to be examined. Every possibility had to be tested. A genetic relationship alone was not enough. Investigators needed to build a complete picture. The work combined science with traditional detective skills. DNA provided the direction. Historical research provided the path. Together, they created a trail leading back toward the person connected to the 1956 murders. Eventually, that trail led investigators to Kenneth Gould. For a case that had remained unresolved since the 1950s, the identification represented a dramatic turning point. A mystery that had survived generations was finally connected to a specific individual. But the announcement also highlighted one of the most difficult aspects of solving decades-old crimes. Sometimes, the truth arrives too late. By the time Gould was identified, he had already died. The man believed responsible for the deaths of Lloyd and Patricia would never appear in court. He would never face a jury. He would never answer questions under oath. The families would never hear him explain what happened. This created a complicated ending to a case that had demanded justice for so long. There was resolution, but there was also absence. There was an answer, but there was no confrontation. For investigators, the identification was a significant achievement. For the families, it was a moment filled with conflicting emotions. After decades of uncertainty, they finally knew who was responsible. But knowing a name could never undo what had happened. It could not return two teenagers to their families. It could not restore the futures that had been taken away. The passage of time had solved one mystery, but it could not erase the tragedy. The story of Lloyd and Patricia also showed the importance of preserving evidence. Many cold cases are solved because investigators from previous generations carefully protected information they could not yet understand. The detectives of 1956 could not have known that future technology would analyze the evidence in ways they never imagined. But they preserved it. And decades later, that decision made a difference. A crime seen from the past became a source of answers in the present. This transformation reflects one of the most remarkable changes in modern criminal investigations. Evidence is no longer limited by the era in which it was collected. A piece of information, discovered decades ago, may become valuable when new technology appears. A clue that once seemed meaningless may eventually become the key. The murders of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky demonstrate this idea clearly. The evidence did not change. The science changed. And because science changed, the possibility of justice changed with it. The case also became part of a larger conversation about the role of forensic genetic genealogy. The method has helped investigators identify suspects in numerous cold cases, bringing answers to families who had waited years or even decades. But it also requires careful handling. Genetic information involves real people and real families. Investigators must balance the search for justice with the responsibility of using sensitive information appropriately. In the Bogle and Kalitsky case, the goal remained the same from beginning to end. Find the truth. Identify the person responsible. Provide answers to those who had waited for decades. The case no longer represented an impossible mystery, but it remained a reminder of the human cost behind every investigation. Because every cold case is more than a file, more than evidence, more than a headline. Behind the investigation are people who lost someone they loved, people who continued remembering birthdays, anniversaries, and moments that should have been shared, people who carried unanswered questions for years. Lloyd and Patricia were teenagers whose lives ended far too soon. Their story was interrupted on a night that changed everything. But their names endured. They endured through the investigation, through the memories of their families, through the determination of detectives, and through the evidence that eventually revealed the truth. More than 55 years after their deaths, the mystery was finally solved. But the case left behind a powerful message. Time may pass. Technology may change. Generations may come and go. But the search for truth can continue. Because sometimes the answers are still there. Waiting. Silent. Until the moment someone finds the way to make them speak. For more than 5 decades, the names Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky remain tied to one of Montana's most painful unanswered questions. 2 teenagers. One violent night. A mystery that refused to disappear. The investigation had crossed generations, survived changing technology, and endured countless moments when the possibility of justice seemed to be fading away. But behind every cold case is a simple truth. The victims never become a cold case. The files may grow old. The evidence may sit untouched for years. The headlines may vanish. But for the people who love those victims, the search never truly ends. That was the reality surrounding Lloyd and Patricia. Their deaths were not simply a historical event. They were a loss that continued affecting families and a community long after the crime scene was gone. The world changed around the case. The investigators changed. The technology changed. But the need for answers remained exactly the same. When authorities finally identified Kenneth Gould through forensic genetic genealogy, the discovery represented a breakthrough that many people once believed would never happen. A mystery that had lasted longer than many careers in law enforcement was finally coming to an end. But the road to that moment was built on decades of unanswered questions and careful investigation. The original detectives, who worked the case in 1956, faced a completely different environment. They had no modern DNA databases, no advanced laboratory techniques, no digital tools capable of revealing hidden connections. They worked with what they had: physical evidence, witness statements, the details of the crime scene, their own ability to reconstruct events from limited information. Every investigator who touched the case carried the same responsibility: find the truth. But as the years passed, the investigation faced the same obstacle that affects many cold cases. The evidence existed, but the technology needed to understand it did not. The crime had been committed in one era. The solution would come from another. That contrast became one of the defining elements of the Bogle and Kalitsky investigation. The answer had been waiting in the past. It simply required the future to uncover it. The emergence of forensic genetic genealogy created a new possibility. For decades, investigators had relied on traditional methods of comparison. A fingerprint had to match. A witness had to identify someone. A suspect had to be connected through evidence that could be presented in court. But DNA introduced a completely different way of looking at investigations. Human biology itself could become a roadmap. Genetic genealogy allowed investigators to explore relationships that extended far beyond the immediate suspect pool. A person connected to a crime could potentially be identified through relatives who had never been involved in the investigation. The method turned family history into investigative evidence. And in the Bogle and Kalitsky case, that approach became the key that opened a door that had been locked since 1956. The genetic trail eventually led investigators toward Kenneth Gould. The discovery was significant not only because it identified a person connected to the murders. It demonstrated that time itself was no longer enough to protect an unknown offender from being identified. A crime committed decades earlier could still be investigated. Evidence collected generations ago could still matter. The past could still reach the present. But while the identification brought answers, it also created a painful reality. There would never be a courtroom ending. Kenneth Gould had died before authorities publicly identified him as the person responsible. The legal process that many people associate with justice would never happen. There would be no trial, no jury hearing the evidence, no testimony explaining the events of that night, no final confrontation between the families and the person accused of taking 2 young lives. Instead, the conclusion came through investigation and science. The evidence provided the answer, but the unanswered emotional questions remained. This is one of the most difficult parts of many cold cases. Solving a crime does not always mean understanding every detail. It does not always reveal every motivation. It does not always provide the kind of closure people imagine. Sometimes, the truth arrives with limitations. Sometimes, justice comes in an unexpected form. For the families of Lloyd and Patricia, the identification of Gould ended one painful uncertainty. They no longer had to wonder whether the killer would ever be found. They no longer had to live with the possibility that the truth had disappeared forever. But the discovery could not erase decades of grief. It could not restore the years lost. It could not change the fact that 2 teenagers who should have grown into adulthood never had that opportunity. Their lives ended before they could experience the future waiting for them. The case also highlighted the importance of remembering victims beyond the circumstances of their deaths. In many criminal investigations, the focus naturally turns toward the suspect. The investigation, the evidence, the breakthrough. But before there was a mystery, there were 2 people. Lloyd Bogle was an 18-year-old young man with a life ahead of him. Patricia Kalitsky was an 18-year-old young woman with hopes and dreams of her own. Their story should have been about birthdays, relationships, careers, and ordinary moments. Instead, their names became connected to one of Montana's most enduring murder investigations. The breakthrough decades later changed how many people viewed the case. It showed that unsolved does not always mean forgotten. It showed that evidence can survive longer than anyone expects. It showed that investigators can return to cases once considered impossible and find new answers. Across the country, cold case investigations began entering a new era. Law enforcement agencies started looking again at old files. Cases that had remained untouched for years were reopened. Evidence that once appeared to have reached its limit was examined through new technology. The story of Lloyd and Patricia became part of this transformation. Their case represented the power of persistence. It represented the connection between old-fashioned detective work and modern science. The investigators who first worked the crime scene in 1956 and the scientists who later analyzed the DNA were separated by decades. But they were connected by the same goal: finding the truth. Every person involved in the investigation played a role. The original detectives preserved the evidence. Later investigators recognized its potential. Scientists developed methods capable of analyzing it. Together, those efforts created a chain that stretched across more than half a century. And at the end of that chain was an answer. The mystery that had haunted Montana since 1956 was no longer a mystery. But the story of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky remains a reminder of the cost of violent crime. Because even when a case is solved, the loss remains. A family still remembers. A community still mourns. A life interrupted cannot be restored. The discovery of the killer brought a conclusion to the investigation. But it also preserved the memory of two teenagers whose lives mattered long before they became part of a cold case file. More than 55 years after their deaths, the truth finally emerged. Not because someone confessed, not because a witness returned, but because evidence that had remained silent for generations finally found a way to speak. For more than half a century, the murder case of Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky existed in a space between memory and mystery. It was a case that refused to disappear. A case that remained open even as decades passed. A case where the victims' names continued to appear in old records, old newspaper archives, and the memories of those who believed the truth would eventually come. But behind the investigation was a difficult reality. The longer a case remains unsolved, the harder it becomes to find answers. Witnesses disappear. Evidence becomes harder to interpret. People connected to the investigation grow older. And with every passing year, the possibility of resolution seems to move farther away. That was the challenge investigators faced with the murders of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky. The crime had occurred in 1956. The solution would come more than 55 years later. Between those 2 points was a long journey filled with uncertainty, persistence, and the determination to never completely abandon the search for justice. The identification of Kenneth Gould represented the final breakthrough, but it was built on decades of investigative effort. Cold cases are rarely solved because of one single discovery. More often, they are solved because pieces of information collected over many years eventually come together. A detail noticed by one investigator. Evidence preserved by another. A scientific advancement that changes what is possible. The Bogle and Kalitsky case followed that pattern. For many years, the evidence remained untouched by the limitations of the technology available at the time. But the evidence itself did not become less important. It simply waited. When investigators returned to the case using modern forensic methods, they were not starting from the beginning. They were continuing a search that had started decades earlier. The original investigators had already done the difficult work of documenting the crime. They had preserved information that would eventually become critical. The detectives of the 1950s could not have known how valuable those decisions would become. They were collecting evidence for an investigation that future generations would finish. The arrival of forensic genetic genealogy changed the direction of the case. Before this method became widely used, many cold cases faced the same obstacle. Investigators could develop DNA evidence, but if there was no direct match in law enforcement databases, the trail ended. The evidence could prove that a person was connected to a crime scene. But it could not always reveal who that person was. Genetic genealogy created another possibility. Instead of searching only for the person who left behind the DNA, investigators could search for relatives. The science worked by identifying shared genetic relationships. Those relationships could lead investigators through family trees, sometimes across several generations, until they reached an individual connected to the original evidence. It was a process requiring patience and precision. A single genetic connection could represent thousands of possibilities. Investigators had to separate meaningful information from unrelated matches. They had to confirm relationships. They had to reconstruct family histories. It was detective work performed through DNA. And in the case of Lloyd and Patricia, that process eventually led investigators toward Kenneth Gould. The breakthrough was historic. After decades of uncertainty, authorities finally had a person connected to one of Montana's most enduring mysteries. But the conclusion was unlike many criminal cases. There was no arrest, no courtroom, no trial, No final statement from the person identified as responsible. Because Gould had already died before investigators connected him to the murders. That fact changed the emotional impact of the discovery. For investigators, the case was solved. For the families, the answer finally arrived. But there was still a sense of something missing. A trial often serves as the final public chapter of a murder investigation. It allows evidence to be presented. It allows witnesses to speak. It allows a community to understand what happened. In this case, that final chapter could never happen. The truth had arrived, but the full story remained incomplete. The absence of a confession meant that many questions surrounding the crime would likely remain unanswered forever. What was the motive? What exactly happened during the final moments of Lloyd and Patricia's lives? Why did that night end in tragedy? Those questions remained part of the mystery. The evidence could identify responsibility, but it could not reveal every thought or decision that led to the crime. This is the painful reality of many cases solved years after they occurred. The investigation may reach its conclusion, but the human need for understanding often continues. The families of victims do not only want a name. They want to know why. They want to understand how something so devastating could happen. They want the person responsible to acknowledge the harm caused. But time does not always allow that. Sometimes, the truth arrives after the opportunity for answers has disappeared. The case of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitzky also showed how victims can become symbols of a larger issue. Their story became connected to the evolution of forensic science. It became an example of how old cases could be reopened and reconsidered. But before the science and investigation, there were two young people. Two teenagers whose lives were much more than the tragedy that ended them. They had families who loved them. They had friends who remembered them. They had futures that were never allowed to happen. The passage of decades changed the world around them. But their importance never changed. Their names continue to represent the reason cold case investigations matter. Because every unresolved crime represents someone waiting for answers. Someone waiting for justice. Someone waiting for the truth. The breakthrough in the Bogle and Kalitzky case also demonstrated the importance of persistence in law enforcement. Many cold cases are not solved because investigators stop caring. They remain unsolved because the necessary tools do not yet exist. A case can be impossible today and solvable tomorrow. Technology can transform what once seemed like a dead end into a new beginning. The evidence that failed to provide answers in 1956 eventually became the key decades later. The same material that could not identify a killer in the past became the foundation for solving the case in the future. That transformation is what makes the story of Lloyd and Patricia so significant. It is not only about a crime. It is about the relationship between time, science, and justice. It is about the idea that unanswered questions can survive for decades without disappearing. And it is about the belief that victims deserve to be remembered, no matter how much time passes. The murders of Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitzky began as a tragedy that shocked a community. They became a mystery that lasted for generations. And eventually, they became an example of how determination and technology could uncover the truth. But even after the identity of the killer was revealed, the story did not end. Because the final chapter of any murder case is not only about finding who committed the crime. It is about remembering who was lost. And for Lloyd and Patricia, that memory continues. Two teenagers. Two lives taken too soon. One case that waited 55 years for the truth to finally emerge. For 55 years, the murders of Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitzky remained a question without an answer. A case that began in the quiet landscape of Montana became a decades-long search for truth. The investigation crossed from one era into another. From handwritten reports to advanced forensic laboratories. From detectives following physical clues to scientists following genetic connections. The world changed around the case, but one thing remained constant. The search for justice. The identification of Kenneth Gould brought a conclusion to one of Montana's longest-running cold cases. But the discovery was not only significant because it named the person responsible. It represented something much larger. It showed that time does not always protect those responsible for violent crimes. It showed that evidence can survive beyond generations. And it showed that even when a case appears forgotten, the truth can still be waiting. The investigation into Lloyd and Patricia's murders had always been defined by patience. There were no quick answers, no immediate arrest, no dramatic confession. Instead, there were years of uncertainty, years when investigators had to accept that the case might remain unsolved forever. But every cold case carries the possibility of change. A new witness may come forward. A new piece of evidence may be discovered. A new technology may transform the entire investigation. For the Bogle and Kalitzky case, that transformation came through genetic genealogy. The science behind the breakthrough represented a new chapter in criminal investigations. Traditional DNA testing had already changed law enforcement, but genetic genealogy expanded the possibilities even further. It allowed investigators to search beyond known databases. It allowed them to explore connections between individuals who were not directly linked to a crime. It allowed them to follow a trail through family history. The method required investigators to think differently. Instead of asking only, who matches this DNA? They began asking, who is related to this DNA? That question changed everything. The investigation became a search through generations. A journey through names, records, and biological connections. The process was complex and required careful examination. A genetic connection could point investigators in the right direction, but it was only the beginning. Every possibility had to be verified. Every family relationship had to be studied. Every piece of information had to be carefully connected back to the original evidence. The investigation was not simply about finding a name. It was about proving that the name belonged to the person connected to the crime. Eventually, the evidence pointed toward Kenneth Gould. The revelation ended a mystery that had lasted longer than many people believed possible. But it also created a unique situation. The person identified as responsible would never stand trial. Gould had already died before authorities announced the connection. There would be no courtroom testimony, no opportunity for prosecutors to present the full case before a jury, no chance for the victims' families to hear answers directly from the person who had taken their loved ones away. That reality shaped the final chapter of the investigation. The case was solved through evidence, not through a confession, not through a verdict, not through a sentence. For many people, that distinction mattered. Because justice is not only about identifying responsibility, it is also about accountability. And in this case, accountability could only exist through the historical record and the findings of investigators. The families of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitzky received something they had waited decades to know. They knew who was responsible, but they were also left with the knowledge that some questions would never be answered. The person connected to the crime could no longer explain his actions. The final details of that night remained hidden. The motive remained uncertain. The full sequence of events could never be completely reconstructed. That uncertainty is one of the most haunting aspects of the case. Even after the greatest mystery was solved, another mystery remained. Why did it happen? What led to the deaths of two teenagers whose lives had barely begun? Those questions are often the hardest for families to accept. Because an identification can provide information, but it cannot restore what was lost. Lloyd and Patricia were teenagers when their lives ended. They were not known because of the crime. They were known because they were people. People with families. People with friends. People who had ordinary hopes and ordinary dreams. Their lives were reduced to a tragic investigation only because violence interrupted their futures. The decades-long search for answers also demonstrated the importance of preserving cold case evidence. Without that evidence, the breakthrough might never have happened. The investigators who worked the case in 1956 could not have known what future science would accomplish. They could not have predicted that decades later, a laboratory would analyze the evidence using methods beyond their imagination. But they preserved it. They documented it. They protected the possibility that someday someone would find the answer. That decision became a bridge between generations of investigators. The detectives of the past and the scientists of the future were connected by the same mission: to uncover the truth. The Bogle and Kalitsky case became part of a broader movement in law enforcement. Across the United States, agencies began returning to old investigations with new tools. Cases that had remained silent for decades were reopened. Evidence once considered impossible to use became valuable again. Families who had lived without answers began receiving unexpected news. The message was powerful. Cold does not mean forgotten. Unsolved does not mean impossible. Time does not always erase the evidence. Sometimes, it simply delays the moment when the truth can finally be revealed. The story of Lloyd and Patricia became an example of that idea. Their case remained open through decades of uncertainty because investigators continued believing that answers were possible. The breakthrough did not happen because the case was easy. It happened because people continued searching. Because evidence was preserved. Because science continued advancing. And because the victims were never forgotten. The murders of Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky remain one of the most memorable examples of how modern technology can transform criminal investigations. A case from 1956 was solved using tools developed decades later. A mystery that had survived generations finally reached a conclusion. But the emotional impact of the case remains. Because every solved investigation represents more than an ending. It represents a reminder of what was lost. It represents the families who waited. It represents the victims whose names deserve to be remembered. More than 55 years after the tragedy, the truth finally emerged. But the story of Lloyd and Patricia continues to carry the same message. Behind every cold case is a person. Behind every piece of evidence is a life. And behind every search for justice is the hope that someday, no matter how much time has passed, the silence will finally be broken. For decades, the story of Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky remained unfinished. It existed as an open wound in Montana's history. A case remembered not because it had answers, but because it had none. A crime that left behind evidence, questions, and a painful silence that lasted longer than anyone could have imagined. But the passage of time did not erase the importance of the investigation. Instead, it revealed something remarkable. A case does not have to be solved quickly to matter. A victim does not have to be remembered by millions to deserve justice. And evidence does not lose its value simply because years pass. The discovery of Kenneth Gould as the person responsible for the murders marked the end of a 55-year search. But the significance of the case extended far beyond one investigation. It became an example of how the future can sometimes solve the mysteries of the past. The crime occurred in a world completely different from the one that eventually uncovered the truth. In 1956, investigators worked without the advantages that modern detectives now consider essential. There was no ability to search genetic databases, no instant communication between agencies, no digital archives containing decades of information. Police officers depended on careful observation, experience, and persistence. They had to collect evidence and preserve it without knowing whether it would ever lead to an answer. The detectives who investigated the deaths of Lloyd and Patricia were working against time. They knew they were searching for someone who had committed a devastating crime. But they did not know that the solution would require a scientific breakthrough more than half a century in the future. The evidence collected at the time became a connection between two different eras. The investigators of 1956 provided the foundation. The scientists and detectives of the future provided the tools. Together, they created a path toward the truth. The case also demonstrated why cold case investigations require extraordinary patience. Unlike active investigations, where leads and witnesses are often available immediately, cold cases are built around uncertainty. A detective reopening an old case may find that many people connected to the original investigation are gone. Memories may have changed. Documents may be incomplete. The world surrounding the crime may no longer exist in the same way. But the mission remains the same. Find the truth. Give answers to the victims' families. Hold the facts together, even when decades have passed. That mission guided investigators who returned to the Bogle and Kalitsky case. They did not see an old file. They saw 2 young lives interrupted. They saw a mystery that still deserved attention. They saw evidence that had waited years for the right technology. The breakthrough through forensic genetic genealogy represented a dramatic change in how investigators approached the case. The method had already shown that some of America's oldest mysteries could still be solved. It provided a new path when traditional investigations had reached their limits. Instead of searching only for known criminals, investigators could examine relationships hidden within genetic information. The process was like rebuilding a map from fragments. A distant genetic connection could lead to a family line. A family line could lead to a specific individual. And a specific individual could finally be compared with the evidence from the original crime. In the Bogle and Kalitsky investigation, this method eventually led authorities to Kenneth Gould. After years of uncertainty, the case finally had a conclusion. But the conclusion was complicated by the passage of time. The person identified as responsible was no longer alive. That meant the justice system could not provide the traditional ending many people expected. There was no trial, no jury, no sentence, no public explanation from the person accused. For some, this created a feeling that something remained unfinished. Because while solving a crime provides answers, a courtroom often provides accountability. It allows a community to hear the evidence. It allows families to express their pain. It allows history to record the full process of justice. In this case, the final answer came in a different way. It came through investigation. It came through science. It came through evidence that had survived for generations. The families of Lloyd and Patricia were finally given confirmation of what had happened. But the emotional impact of the discovery was complex. After decades of wondering, they finally knew. But knowing could never undo the loss. A solved case does not bring back a person. It does not restore birthdays that were missed. It does not return the years that families spent waiting. It does not erase the memory of a tragedy. The identification of Gould also raised awareness about the importance of remembering victims. In many crime stories, attention naturally focuses on the person responsible. The investigation becomes centered on suspects, evidence, and breakthroughs. But the heart of every case is the person who was lost. Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky were more than the victims of a crime. They were teenagers with futures ahead of them. They were loved by family and friends. They were individuals whose lives had meaning beyond the tragedy that followed. Their story survived because people refused to allow them to become forgotten names in an old police file. The case also showed the remarkable relationship between persistence and technology. Technology alone does not solve crimes. DNA does not investigate itself. A genetic match does not create a complete story. Behind every breakthrough are people who recognize the value of evidence and continue searching for answers. Investigators must ask the right questions. Scientists must develop the right methods. Families must continue demanding that victims are remembered. The solution to the Bogle and Kalitsky murders was the result of all those efforts coming together. A crime from 1956 was finally connected to the modern world. The evidence that once represented an unanswered question became the evidence that provided the answer. And that transformation changed the way many people viewed cold cases. It proved that time is not always the end of an investigation. Sometimes, time is simply another part of the investigation. Every year that passed created more distance from the crime. But every year also brought new technology, new possibilities, new ways to search for the truth. The story of Lloyd and Patricia became a powerful reminder that justice does not always follow a predictable timeline. Sometimes it arrives quickly. Sometimes it takes decades. But the search can continue. The case that began as a tragedy in 1956 eventually became a landmark example of perseverance and scientific progress. The mystery that haunted Montana for more than half a century finally had an answer. Yet the memory of Lloyd and Patricia remains the most important part of the story. Because long after investigations end and headlines disappear, the victims are what remain. Their names, their lives, their memories, and the enduring hope that every unanswered question can someday find its way toward the truth. More than half a century after the deaths of Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky, one of Montana's most enduring mysteries finally reached an answer. But the story did not end with the identification of a killer. Because the true measure of a case is not only found in the moment when a suspect is named. It is found in the lives that were lost, the families who waited, the investigators who refused to stop searching, and the evidence that remained silent until the world finally had the ability to understand it. For 55 years, the murders of Lloyd and Patricia represented a question that seemed impossible to solve. The case began in 1956, during a time when forensic technology was limited and investigators had only traditional methods available. They searched. They questioned. They examined every detail they could find. But the answer remained hidden. The person responsible disappeared into history while the families of the victims carried the weight of uncertainty. Decade after decade passed. The world entered new generations. Technology transformed everyday life. And eventually, the same progress that changed the world also changed criminal investigations. A crime scene from the past became a doorway to the truth. The evidence collected more than 5 decades earlier became the key. Through forensic genetic genealogy, investigators were able to follow a path that previous generations of detectives could never have imagined. The science connected relationships. The investigation connected history. And together, they led authorities to Kenneth Gould. For a case that had remained unresolved for generations, the identification represented a remarkable breakthrough. The mystery surrounding the deaths of Lloyd and Patricia was no longer a question without an answer. The truth had finally emerged. But the ending was not the kind of ending many people imagine when they think about justice. There was no courtroom, no trial, no public testimony, no final confrontation, because the person identified as responsible had already died. The case was solved, but the opportunity for a traditional legal resolution had disappeared with time. That reality created a complicated form of closure. For investigators, the discovery represented success. For the families, it provided an answer they had waited decades to receive. But for everyone connected to the case, there was also the understanding that some questions would never be answered. The person responsible could no longer explain his actions. The exact reasons behind the crime remained unknown. The final moments of Lloyd and Patricia's lives remained partly hidden. And that is what makes the case so haunting. Even after the greatest mystery was solved, another mystery remained. Why? Why did a night that should have been ordinary become a tragedy? Why did 2 teenagers with their entire futures ahead of them never get the chance to live those futures? Those questions are often the ones that stay with families the longest. Because justice is not only about finding who committed a crime. It is also about understanding the human story behind it. Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky were not simply names in a police report. They were young people. They had families who cared about them. They had friends who remembered them. They had dreams that ended far too soon. The passage of time changed many things. The investigators changed. The technology changed. The world changed. But the importance of their lives did not. Their story became a reminder that victims must remain at the center of every investigation. The discovery of the killer may be the moment that captures public attention. But the reason investigations continue is because of the people who were taken away. The case also left behind a powerful lesson about the future of criminal investigations. The murders of Lloyd and Patricia showed that cold cases are not always closed cases. A case can remain unsolved for years, even decades. But that does not mean the truth is gone. Sometimes, the evidence is simply waiting for the right moment. Waiting for better science. Waiting for new investigators. Waiting for someone willing to look again. The breakthrough in this case demonstrated the extraordinary potential of forensic genetic genealogy. A method that once seemed impossible became a tool capable of solving mysteries that had survived generations. It changed the way law enforcement approached old cases. It showed families across the country that time does not always prevent justice. And it proved that evidence from the past can still speak in the present. The story of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitzky will always carry sadness. Because no investigation can change what happened. No scientific discovery can restore the lives that were lost. No answer can return the years that families spent waiting. But the truth matters. Knowing what happened matters. Remembering the victims matters. For decades, Lloyd and Patricia's names were connected to a question. Now, they are connected to an answer. Their case stands as a reminder of the power of persistence, of investigators who kept searching, of families who kept remembering, of scientists who developed new ways to uncover the truth, and of evidence that survived long enough to finally reveal what happened. The murders that shocked Montana in 1956 became a story that crossed generations. A story that moved from handwritten case files to modern laboratories. A story that showed how the past and present can come together in the search for justice. More than 55 years after 2 teenagers were killed, the mystery was finally solved. But the final legacy of the case is not only about the person responsible. It is about Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitzky. 2 young people whose lives mattered. 2 victims whose names were never forgotten. 2 teenagers whose story proved that even after decades of silence, the truth can still be found. Because some cases are not solved by time. They are solved because someone refuses to stop searching. And sometimes, after generations have passed and hope has nearly disappeared, the smallest piece of evidence can bring back the one thing families have been waiting for all along. The truth. There is a common belief that every murder investigation ends the moment the killer is identified. A name is announced. A press conference is held. Reporters file their final stories. The case is marked solved, and history quietly moves on. But reality is rarely that simple. For the families of Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitzky, the announcement in 2021 did not erase 65 years of absence. It did not restore birthdays that had passed without them, holiday dinners where their chairs remained empty, or the countless moments when loved ones wondered what their lives might have become. Justice had finally caught up with the evidence. Time, however, could never be reversed. The investigation into the murders of Lloyd and Patricia would soon become something larger than a single criminal case. Across the United States, detectives studying unsolved homicides looked at the Montana investigation as proof that the oldest files in their archives might still contain answers waiting to be uncovered. 4 generations, cold case units had lived with the uncomfortable reality that many investigations simply reached a dead end. Detectives retired, witnesses died, paper records yellowed inside filing cabinets, boxes of photographs gathered dust on forgotten shelves. Every year that passed seemed to push justice a little farther away. Then forensic genetic genealogy changed the conversation. Instead of asking whether an old case could still be solved, investigators began asking a different question. Was enough evidence preserved? That subtle shift transformed law enforcement's approach to unsolved murders. evidence that had once seemed exhausted was suddenly viewed as a valuable scientific resource. Biological material collected decades earlier could now tell a story impossible to hear when it was first discovered. The Bogle-Kalitsky investigation became one of many examples demonstrating that preservation mattered just as much as investigation. Every carefully labeled envelope, every preserved laboratory sample, every photograph, every handwritten report, every decision made by investigators in 1956 contributed to the possibility of solving the case decades later. Ironically, the detectives who protected that evidence never lived to see the technology that ultimately unlocked it. Their work became a gift to future investigators. The identification of Kenneth Gould also illustrated an important truth about forensic science. DNA is extraordinarily powerful, but it is not magic. It does not recreate conversations. It does not reveal motives. It cannot explain why violence erupted on a particular night. Science answered one fundamental question: who? Other questions remain beyond its reach. Why Lloyd and Patricia? Why that evening? What exactly unfolded during the final minutes before their deaths? Without a confession or surviving eyewitness testimony, those answers may never be fully known. That uncertainty is difficult for investigators to accept. Police officers are trained to seek complete narratives. They want timelines, motives, opportunities, and evidence that fits together without gaps. The Bogle-Kalitsky case never offered that luxury. Instead, it delivered something equally important: truth supported by evidence. Not every mystery within the case disappeared, but the central mystery did. The identity of the man responsible was finally established. For many people outside law enforcement, the story reinforced another lesson. Cold cases are not failures. They are unfinished investigations. Sometimes they remain unfinished because technology has not yet caught up with the evidence. Sometimes they remain unfinished because the right question has not yet been asked. Sometimes they remain unfinished because the answer is still waiting inside a piece of evidence collected decades earlier. Across America, families with loved ones in unsolved murder cases watched stories like this one with cautious optimism. Many understood that every successful identification represented more than one solved case. It represented hope. Hope that another detective would reopen another forgotten file. Hope that another laboratory would test another decades-old sample. Hope that another family might someday receive the phone call they had almost stopped expecting. For the community around Great Falls, Montana, the passage of time ensured that many residents knew the case only through newspaper archives or stories passed down by older generations. Yet memory has a remarkable way of surviving. The names Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky endured because communities remember tragedies that reshaped their history. Their story became part of Montana's criminal history, not simply because the murders were shocking, but because the search for answers lasted across generations. Today, investigators entering law enforcement learn about cases like this for reasons that extend beyond the crime itself. They study the importance of preserving evidence. They learn patience. They learn that today's limitations may disappear tomorrow. Most importantly, they learn that every victim deserves the possibility of future justice, even when immediate justice seems impossible. That may be the greatest legacy left by Lloyd and Patricia. Not simply that their killer was identified, but that their case changed how people think about the passage of time. For decades, time appeared to favor the unknown killer. In the end, time favored the evidence. And perhaps that is the most remarkable ending of all. A crime committed during the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower was ultimately illuminated by 21st century science. Two teenagers whose voices had been silenced were finally heard through the smallest fragments of biological evidence imaginable. No dramatic arrest followed. No courtroom verdict echoed through a packed courthouse. There was only a quiet announcement supported by careful science, meticulous investigation, and decades of determination. Sometimes justice arrives with flashing cameras. Sometimes it arrives in silence. The story of Lloyd, Dwayne Bogle, and Patricia Kalitsky belongs to the second kind. A story that reminds us the truth can be delayed, but it is not always lost. A story proving that evidence, when protected, can outlive assumptions, technology, and even the people who first collected it. And a story ensuring that two teenagers who should have been remembered only for the lives they hope to live will instead also be remembered for changing. The future of cold case investigations, showing investigators everywhere that even after generations pass, the pursuit of truth is never truly over.